Hey, Cheyenne East. Continuing our topic analysis, let's talk about the forensic science part of this year's topic. Let's start with the basics. As the first bullet points notes, forensic science is probably a little bit more in-depth than we might otherwise think. At least for me, when I approached this topic, I typically thought of forensic science in the same way that television shows think of forensic science. We think of fingerprints, ballistics, DNA, maybe blood spatter analysis. But in reality, the forensic science toolbox that is available in the criminal justice system extends to a wide variety of scientific disciplines, including the coroner's office, medical examination, dental examination, and a number of other evidence-based analysis that you may use in a crime scene. So when you are thinking about and getting ready to debate a forensic science affirmative, understand you could be hit with something relatively obscure, at least as you think of forensic science. But one of the key parts of the forensic science portion of the topic is it is an area where there is a tremendous amount of overlap between the federal and state criminal justice systems. Not in the sense that you have jurisdictional overlap, but in the sense that there's a lot of cooperation between federal and state law enforcement, because local crime labs that may be administered by a city, or even, for example, in Wyoming, which are administered by the state, they lack all of the necessary resources to conduct every single potential forensic science issue that may come up. They can handle things like analyzing a substance to see whether it's a drug, but maybe they need help in running DNA analysis. So the FBI, which has a very large crime laboratory and more people devoted to more specific disciplines, often serves as a assistant to state efforts where states will send samples or other evidence to the FBI lab for testing. Maybe it's hair analysis or skin analysis or fingerprint analysis or ballistics analysis. But whatever it may be, there is a lot of cooperation between the federal and state government, and there's also a lot of money exchanged between the federal government and local crime laboratories. So there is a monetary tie as part of that cooperation. There's also, again, because of that cooperation, a fair amount of federal agencies that are involved. The FBI is the main one, but a number of other federal agencies have forensic science that's done within them. For example, the Department of Homeland Security has a forensic science team tasked with identifying potential loose nuclear material that may be on United States soil, or biological or chemical issues that could be developed into weapons. So there is a lot of potential here for affirmative and negative arguments related to the practice of forensic science throughout the United States. But the key takeaway here, it's broad and it is overlapping. So there are going to be a lot of nuances that you as the debater need to tease out. Let's talk about the role forensic science plays in the criminal justice system. Hopefully, you've watched the topic analysis video, the general one, before you've gotten to this one. If you have, you'll understand that the criminal justice system has some very discrete components, at least as we would understand it for this year's topic. Those phases involve, among other things, an investigative phase, and then what we refer to as the trial phase, where someone is actually on trial and their guilt, or in a sense, is being decided. Forensic science is one of the few parts of this topic that straddles multiple parts of those systems. It is an investigative tool. We certainly use forensic science to, for example, try and identify who may have committed a crime based on fingerprints, DNA, hair, ballistics. We try and identify substances to see if they're illegal substances. And that analysis in science leads up to the process of charging a particular individual with a crime. But then, once someone is charged with a crime and they're put on trial, we bring those forensic scientists and their evidence and their conclusions into the courtroom. If you were going to try to convict someone of, for example, possessing an illegal substance, you need to put the forensic scientist on the witness stand who did the analysis to determine whether or not the substance was illegal. They need to testify, whether it was or not, how they got to that, and then introduce the substance into evidence in order for that person to be convicted. So forensic science also takes place in the courtroom. This is important because you can have affirmatives that target one or both of these roles as a potential area for reform. You could have affirmatives, and we will talk about these affirmatives, that reform how we do the investigative analysis, how the actual science in the laboratory takes place. You're then going to have affirmatives that say, you know what? The problem is how it's used in the courtroom. So we need to change how forensic science is presented at that point in the criminal justice system. But you, for the purposes of this video, just need to understand that it has a dual function in the system. Now let's talk about the 2009 National Research Council report. It is really the fundamental basis of this part of the topic. Unlike policing and sentencing, which have a bunch of different things going on with different sort of causal points in time, different rationales, and some very specific issues, the forensic science part of this topic really traces its roots back to a single event at a single point in time, and that is the 2009 National Research Council report. A little before 2009, the federal government commissioned the National Research Council to go out and study forensic science throughout the United States. Give the federal government an understanding of where we were as a country in those disciplines. And in 2009, the National Research Council, which is a conglomeration of various academic and scientific agencies within the federal government, came back with a pretty scathing report that identified systemic problems with how we conducted forensic science around the country. And it shined a light both at the federal government as well as state governments and how they were doing forensic science in their respective crime laboratories. And to remedy what was identified as a host of problems with what we may have considered traditional forensic science disciplines like ballistics, fingerprinting, blood analysis, and even DNA analysis, the National Research Council recommended a number of policies, some of which actually got implemented. Some were later taken back, and a number were not. The reason I mention this report is a couple of reasons. First, it will provide the starting point for most every forensic science affirmative because it kicked off a whole body of research over the last decade into why forensic science was not up to snuff. In addition, it can serve as a great jumping off point for affirmatives to identify specific plans as to how they might resolve the problems with forensic science. It's rare in policy debate to have a single document say, here's a bunch of problems, and here are actual policy solutions. Most of the time, our research isn't packaged so neatly. It also provided a jumping off point for people to rebut that. So it provides good resources for negative arguments to push back on its findings. So with that said, with that groundwork laid, let's talk about some potential affirmatives. The first set of affirmatives that you may hear, and we certainly have an example of this, is lab independence. What does that mean? Well, it's something I didn't mention, but in the 2009 report, one of the problems that identified was the ties between crime laboratories and law enforcement. If you remember, I mentioned how the FBI is in control of a large crime laboratory that states rely upon. Well, the FBI is also a law enforcement agency. And so there is the potential that the ties between a law enforcement agency and what should be objective science, not in favor of law enforcement or a potential defendant, could represent bias or the potential for bias. And at the state level and the local level, many crime laboratories are under the control of local law enforcement or prosecuting offices. So there is certainly evidence out there to suggest that those links between law enforcement and forensic scientists create bias, the appearance of bias, or subject them to certain pressures to perform as law enforcement would want. You're going to see affirmatives about setting federal standards. One of the 2009 report's biggest problems with forensic science is there really aren't any uniform standards for how we would do forensic science, meaning a ballistics technician in Wyoming may be analyzing evidence of gunfire in a totally different way than someone doing it in Colorado, which in most scientific fields, you don't really find that. The practice of medicine, for example, that scientific field, most doctors perform procedures the same way no matter where they are in the country because there is a standard for how you perform those procedures. Affirmatives are going to increase accreditation. One of the 2009 report's findings was that it doesn't really take much to become a forensic scientist. You don't necessarily, in some cases, have to have a college degree. You don't have to have some kind of organization who vets you and says that you are approved and certified to do forensic science. And that leads to arguments that perhaps the wrong people or not qualified people are conducting forensic science. And then lastly, I think you're going to hear affirmatives about funding and why there is a lack of funding or the need to use funding differently to improve forensic science. But ultimately, any version of these affirmatives is going to revolve around one pretty simple argument, and that is that forensic science is done poorly or presented poorly, either at the investigative phase or at the trial phase, and so we need to find a way to make it better. Let's close out with negative strategies. Don't be alarmed, there's only 2 listed. There's certainly more options, but these, frankly, are the 2 biggest options for most negatives when they encounter a forensic science affirmative: federalism and the state's counterplan. As I mentioned a moment ago, there is a lot of overlap between the federal government and state governments in conducting forensic science. But despite that overlap, most of the forensic science work done in this country is done at the local level. So any meaningful change, for example, in the standards used to practice forensic science, has to occur at the state level. So you're going to have a lot of affirmatives that use some method to affect change at the state level, and that invites the federalism dissent. Likewise, it invites the state's counterplan to have the states undertake that reform effort. So in addition to those arguments, we will certainly have case arguments, but forensic science is one of those areas of the topic where the negative is going to have a little more difficulty generating substantive arguments, substantive disadvantages, just because most people don't write about the problems with forensic science. And to be perfectly honest, the vast majority of the literature out there does suggest that forensic science really isn't up to snuff. But take heart, we will find a way to defeat those affirmatives.